The morning sun beat down on Fort Jackson's motor pool, turning the asphalt into a shimmering lake of heat. Master Sergeant Helen Crawford stood beside the broken M1 Abrams tank, her weathered hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the scene before her. At 62 years old, she had seen more military equipment than most soldiers would encounter in 3 lifetimes. But today, she was invisible. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we've got this handled," said Staff Sergeant Dylan Cooper, barely looking in her direction. He was 35, confident, and had arrived at Fort Jackson 6 months ago with a chip on his shoulder and a brand new certification in armored vehicle maintenance. "These tanks are loaded with computer systems now. It's not like the old days." Helen said nothing. She simply nodded and stepped back, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun beneath her cap. The 3 younger technicians gathered around the massive tank, their tablets and diagnostic equipment spread across a mobile workstation. She had offered to help when the call first came in, but Cooper had made it clear her experience with older models wouldn't be useful here. "The engine won't turn over," explained Specialist Martinez, the youngest of the group at 24. "We've run every diagnostic in the manual. The computer says all systems are green, but she won't start." "Probably a sensor malfunction," Cooper said, tapping commands into his tablet. "These new systems are sensitive. One bad sensor can shut down the whole operation." Helen walked slowly around the tank, her eyes taking in details the younger soldiers missed. She noticed a small puddle of fluid beneath the rear section. She saw the slight discoloration on one of the hydraulic lines. Her fingers itched to dive in and start checking the basics, but she had learned over the past year that her input was rarely welcome anymore. It hadn't always been this way. Helen had joined the Army at 19, back in 1982, when women in military maintenance were rare enough to draw stares. She had worked on everything from jeeps to helicopters, from personnel carriers to the first generation of Abrams tanks. She had served in the Gulf War, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. She had trained hundreds of soldiers, saved countless lives by keeping vehicles running in impossible conditions, and earned every commendation the Army could give to someone in her position. But that was then. Now she was just the old maintenance guy. The phrase had started as a joke among the younger soldiers. "Ask the old maintenance guy," they would say, usually with a smirk. It stung every time, but Helen never corrected them. She had faced worse in her 4 decades of service. Being underestimated was nothing new for a woman in the military, especially one who had outlasted most of her peers. "Sergeant Crawford," called Lieutenant Morrison from across the motor pool. He was the officer in charge of the maintenance division, a man of 43 who had been promoted quickly through administrative channels rather than hands-on experience. "Don't you have paperwork to finish in the office?" It was a dismissal, plain and simple. Helen recognized the tone. Morrison had made it clear when he arrived 2 years ago that he preferred the new generation of technicians, the ones who relied on computers and diagnostics rather than instinct and experience. He had slowly pushed Helen toward desk work, inventory management, and training schedules. Anything to keep her away from the actual machines. "Yes, sir," Helen replied, her voice steady. "I'll head back now." As she walked toward the administrative building, she heard Cooper's voice behind her. "We don't need a museum curator. We need actual technicians." The other soldiers laughed. Helen kept walking, her back straight, her face expressionless. She had learned long ago not to show weakness, not to let them see her hurt. Every insult was a weight she carried silently, added to the collection of slights and dismissals that had accumulated over the past few years. The office was a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and outdated computers. Helen sat at her desk and stared at the stack of maintenance reports waiting for her signature. This was her life now, pushing papers while the real work happened outside, done by men who thought technology had replaced experience. Through the window, she could see the technicians still gathered around the tank. They had been working on it for 3 hours now. She checked her watch. The tank was scheduled for a live fire exercise tomorrow morning, part of a demonstration for a visiting three-star general. If Cooper and his team couldn't get it running, it would reflect badly on the entire base. Helen turned back to her paperwork, trying to focus. But her mind kept drifting to that tank, to the puddle she had seen, to the discolored hydraulic line. She knew what was wrong. 40 years of experience told her exactly where to look and what to fix, but nobody wanted to hear it. By late afternoon, the motor pool was buzzing with frustrated energy. Helen watched from her window as more technicians arrived, called in by Cooper to help diagnose the problem. They brought additional equipment, more tablets, newer diagnostic tools. The tank sat silent and stubborn, refusing to cooperate. Lieutenant Morrison appeared, his face tight with stress. Helen could read his body language from across the yard. He was worried. The demonstration tomorrow was a big deal. General Patricia Hayes was coming from the Pentagon, and Fort Jackson wanted to impress her. A broken tank would be an embarrassment. Helen's phone rang. It was Morrison's assistant. "Sergeant Crawford, the lieutenant wants to see you in his office." She walked across the compound, her boots crunching on gravel. Morrison's office was larger than hers, with commendations on the walls and a large window overlooking the motor pool. He sat behind his desk, his fingers drumming nervously on the surface. "Crawford, I need you to help with the coordination tomorrow," he said without preamble. "The general arrives at 0800. I want you to handle the paperwork side of the demonstration. Make sure all the documentation is in order, the maintenance logs are updated, all that administrative stuff." "What about the tank, sir?" Helen asked. "Have they identified the problem?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "Cooper says they'll have it fixed by tonight. It's just a software glitch. They're uploading a patch from the manufacturer." Helen hesitated. This was the moment. She could speak up, offer her assessment, risk being dismissed or mocked again. Or she could stay silent, do her assigned job, and let the younger technicians figure it out on their own. "Sir, I noticed," she began. "Crawford, I don't have time for old war stories right now," Morrison interrupted. "Cooper knows what he's doing. These new tanks are beyond what you trained on. Just focus on the paperwork, okay?" Helen felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but she nodded. "Yes, sir." That evening, as the sun set over Fort Jackson, Helen sat in her small apartment on base. She had lived here for 3 years, ever since her divorce was finalized. The walls were bare except for a few photographs. Her daughter's college graduation, her son in his Navy uniform, a picture of her younger self standing beside a tank in the desert, covered in grease and grinning. She looked at that young woman and barely recognized her. Where had that confidence gone? When had she started accepting being pushed aside? Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter, Sarah. "How's it going, Mom? Still putting up with those jerks?" Helen smiled sadly. Sarah was 35 now, a civil engineer in Seattle with strong opinions about how the military treated women, especially older women. They talked often about Helen's struggles, about whether it was time to finally retire. "Same as always," Helen typed back. "Big demonstration tomorrow. I'm on paperwork duty." "You should be running that place, not filing reports." "That's not how it works, honey." "It should be." Helen set her phone down and looked out the window at the motor pool in the distance. The lights were still on. Cooper and his team were still working on the tank. She knew they wouldn't find the answer in their computers. The problem wasn't in the software. It was mechanical, old school, the kind of thing that took hands-on experience to diagnose. But tomorrow morning, when General Hayes arrived, that tank needed to be running. The reputation of Fort Jackson depended on it. And despite how she had been treated, despite the insults and the marginalization, Helen still cared about this place. She had given her life to the Army. She couldn't stand by and watch it fail. She made a decision then, sitting alone in her apartment. She would go back tonight, after everyone left, and look at that tank herself. If she was right about the problem, she would fix it quietly. Nobody needed to know. The tank would work, the demonstration would succeed, and life would go on. It was a small act of rebellion and pride wrapped together. Helen grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. The motor pool was empty when she arrived at 11 p.m. The security lights cast long shadows across the rows of vehicles. The Abrams tank sat alone in the center of the yard, a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. Helen approached slowly, her toolkit in hand. This was against protocol. She should have signed out equipment, logged her presence, gotten authorization. But she was beyond caring about protocol right now. This was about something deeper, proving to herself that she still had value, that 40 years of experience meant something. She slid beneath the tank, her flashlight illuminating the undercarriage. There it was, exactly what she had suspected. A cracked hydraulic line, small enough that it wouldn't show up on digital diagnostics, but significant enough to prevent proper pressure in the starting system. The fluid leak she had noticed earlier confirmed it. This wasn't a computer problem. This was a failure of basic mechanical components, the kind veteran mechanics learned to spot by sight and sound and smell. Helen smiled in the darkness beneath the tank. She had been right. Now came the hard part, fixing it without anyone knowing she had been here. Helen's hands moved with practiced efficiency in the dim light beneath the tank. She had done this kind of repair hundreds of times, in better conditions and in worse. The cracked hydraulic line would need to be replaced completely. She had the parts in the maintenance storage shed, along with the tools she would need. The night air was cool against her face as she emerged from beneath the tank and walked to the storage facility. The building was locked, but she had a key. As the senior maintenance NCO, she still had access to everything, even if Morrison preferred she didn't use it. Inside, the smell of motor oil and metal filled her nostrils. It was a scent she had lived with for 4 decades, more familiar than perfume, more comforting than any candle. The shelves were organized with military precision. Helen found the hydraulic line she needed within minutes, along with the proper fittings and seals. Back at the tank, she worked in silence. The physical labor felt good. Her muscles remembered the movements, even if they protested a bit more than they used to. She removed the damaged line, careful not to spill more hydraulic fluid than necessary. The replacement slid into place smoothly, and she tightened the connections with the exact torque required. It took 2 hours of steady work. When she finished, Helen stood back and surveyed her efforts. The repair was clean, professional, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. She cleaned up every trace of her presence, returned the tools to the shed, and disposed of the damaged parts in the proper container. Before she left, she did something impulsive. She left a small note tucked into the engine compartment, where only someone doing a thorough inspection would find it. Hydraulic line, Section 4, be the old maintenance guy. Helen returned to her apartment at 2 in the morning, exhausted but satisfied. She showered, washing away the grease and grime, and fell into bed. Tomorrow would be interesting. The alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. Helen dressed in her best uniform, making sure every crease was sharp, every button polished. If she was going to be relegated to paperwork duty during the general's visit, she would at least look the part of a master sergeant with 40 years of service. The motor pool was already buzzing with activity when she arrived at 6. Soldiers were cleaning vehicles, setting up the demonstration area, preparing for the general's inspection. And in the center of it all, Staff Sergeant Cooper stood beside the Abrams tank with a confused expression on his face. Helen approached with her clipboard of paperwork, playing her assigned role. "Morning, Sergeant," she said to Cooper. He barely acknowledged her, too focused on the tank. "It's running," he said, more to himself than to her. "I don't understand. We couldn't get it started last night. I was here until midnight. This morning I came in early to call the manufacturer, and I turned the key just to confirm the problem, and it started right up." Maybe your software patch worked after all, Helen suggested mildly. Cooper shook his head. We never actually installed it. The upload kept failing. I was going to try again this morning, but now. He gestured helplessly at the tank, its engine purring smoothly. It just works. Lieutenant Morrison appeared, his relief visible on his face. Cooper, I don't care why it's working. Just be grateful it is. The general arrives in 90 minutes. I want this area spotless and every piece of equipment ready to perform flawlessly. Yes, sir, Cooper replied, still looking puzzled. Helen walked away with a small smile on her face. She set up her station in a corner of the demonstration area, arranging the maintenance logs and documentation that Morrison wanted available for review. It was busy work, unnecessary really, but it kept her out of the way. At 7:45, a convoy of black SUVs rolled through the front gate of Fort Jackson. General Patricia Hayes stepped out of the lead vehicle, and Helen felt an unexpected surge of emotion. The general was 56, wearing her uniform with the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of service. She was one of the highest-ranking women in the Army, and her presence here meant something. Colonel Briggs, the base commander, greeted General Hayes with full military honors. The soldiers assembled in formation, standing at attention as the general inspected the ranks. Helen watched from her corner, invisible as always. The demonstration began at 8:30. The Abrams tank performed perfectly. It maneuvered through the obstacle course, fired its main gun at targets downrange, and showcased all the capabilities that made it one of the finest combat vehicles in the world. Cooper stood nearby, accepting congratulations from Lieutenant Morrison, basking in the success. Helen felt a mix of emotions: pride that the tank was working, that the demonstration was successful; bitterness that her repair had saved the day but would never be acknowledged; resignation that this was simply how things were. General Hayes walked through the motor pool after the demonstration, asking questions about maintenance procedures and equipment readiness. She was thorough, professional, clearly someone who understood the importance of the people who kept the machinery running. When the general reached Helen's station, she paused. "Master Sergeant Crawford," she said, reading the nameplate. "How long have you been in maintenance?" 40 years, ma'am," Helen replied, standing at attention. The general's eyebrows rose. 40 years, that's exceptional. You must have incredible experience with these vehicles. Before Helen could respond, Lieutenant Morrison stepped in. "Sergeant Crawford is primarily handling our administrative operations now, General. Documentation, training schedules, that sort of thing. She's been invaluable in keeping our paperwork organized." The dismissal in his tone was subtle but clear. Helen saw the general's eyes narrow slightly, a flicker of something that might have been understanding or perhaps annoyance. "I see," General Hayes said. "And who handled the repair on the Abrams that was malfunctioning yesterday?" Morrison gestured to Cooper. "Staff Sergeant Cooper, ma'am. He's our lead technician on the newer systems. He diagnosed and resolved a complex software issue." Cooper stepped forward, his chest puffed with pride. "Yes, ma'am. It was a challenging diagnostic, but we managed to isolate the problem and implement a solution." "Explain the technical details," the general said. Cooper launched into an explanation full of jargon about diagnostic protocols and system patches, none of which actually related to the real problem. Helen listened, her face neutral, as he took credit for work he hadn't done, for a fix he hadn't made. General Hayes listened politely, then turned back to Helen. "Master Sergeant, in your 40 years, what would you say is the most common mistake young technicians make?" It was a direct question, impossible to dodge. Helen met the general's eyes and saw something there, a test, perhaps, or an invitation. "They rely too heavily on computers, ma'am," Helen said honestly. "The diagnostic equipment is excellent, but it can't replace hands-on experience. Sometimes the problem is mechanical, not digital. You have to look, listen, and feel the machine to truly understand what's wrong. That's old-school thinking, Cooper interjected, unable to help himself. Modern vehicles are integrated computer systems. You can't maintain them with a wrench and intuition anymore. Is that so? The general asked, her tone mild but her gaze sharp. Yes, ma'am, Cooper said confidently. The days of shade tree mechanics are over. Helen said nothing, but she saw the general's expression shift. There was something calculating in her eyes now, something that made Helen wonder if perhaps this visit was about more than just a simple demonstration. Lieutenant Morrison, General Hayes said, I'd like to see the maintenance logs for that Abrams. All of them, including the repair documentation from yesterday. Morrison's confidence faltered slightly. Of course, ma'am. Sergeant Crawford has all the documentation right here. Helen handed over the folder, her heart beating a little faster. The repair she had done last night wasn't logged. There was no official record because she had done it off the books, outside of protocol. If the general looked closely enough, she would see that something didn't add up. The general flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable. According to this, the tank was marked as non-operational at 2300 hours yesterday. The next entry shows it operational at 0600 this morning, with a note that says software patch successfully implemented. But there's no detailed repair log, no parts requisition, no technical write-up. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. The repair was straightforward, ma'am. Sometimes we don't generate extensive paperwork for simple fixes. A software patch is a simple fix, the general asked. In my experience, any repair that takes a vehicle from non-operational to operational deserves proper documentation. Cooper jumped in, trying to help. Ma'am, the issue was resolved remotely through our diagnostic system. The manufacturer pushed an update directly to the tank's computer. It's all handled digitally now. Show me the digital record, the general said. Cooper's face went pale. The system logs might not have captured it completely. Might not have. The tension in the air was thick now. Helen watched as Cooper stammered through an explanation that made less sense with each word. Morrison's face was turning red, realizing that his star technician was falling apart under basic questioning. General Hayes turned to Helen. Master Sergeant Crawford, you've been in maintenance for 40 years. If a tank goes from broken to fixed overnight, what's the first thing you check? Helen hesitated. This was the moment. She could continue playing her role, staying silent, letting Cooper flounder, or she could tell the truth. I check the maintenance shed for missing parts, ma'am, Helen said quietly, and I look for signs of recent work on the vehicle itself. The general smiled just slightly. Lieutenant Morrison, let's take a walk to the maintenance shed, shall we? What followed was a systematic unraveling of Cooper's story. The maintenance shed showed that a hydraulic line had been signed out at 23:15 hours the previous night, logged under Helen's access code. The disposal container held the damaged line, and when a specialist was sent to inspect the tank's engine compartment, he found Helen's note. Cooper's face went from pale to red to pale again as the truth emerged. Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground, and Helen stood quietly, waiting for whatever consequences were coming her way. So let me understand this correctly, General Hayes said, her voice carrying across the motor pool. Master Sergeant Crawford, who has been relegated to paperwork duty, diagnosed and repaired this tank on her own time, without authorization, because she knew it needed to be operational for today's demonstration. Yes, ma'am, Helen said. I violated protocol by working without proper authorization. That's on me. And Staff Sergeant Cooper took credit for her work. Cooper started to protest, but Morrison cut him off. Ma'am, there seems to have been a miscommunication. Lieutenant, I asked Sergeant Cooper a direct question, the general said sharply. Cooper's shoulders slumped. I assumed the software patch had worked. I didn't know someone else had repaired it. You didn't know or you didn't ask, the general pressed. Silence fell over the motor pool. Everyone was watching now, the demonstration forgotten, all attention focused on this confrontation. General Hayes turned to Helen. Master Sergeant, why didn't you tell anyone you had fixed the tank? Helen thought about her answer carefully. Because, ma'am, nobody would have listened. The simple honesty of those words hung in the air like a challenge. General Hayes stood very still for a long moment, her eyes moving from Helen to Morrison to Cooper and back again. The silence in the motor pool was absolute. Even the distant sounds of the bass seemed to fade away. Nobody would have listened, the general repeated slowly. Lieutenant Morrison, is that true? Morrison's face was flushed, his jaw tight. Ma'am, with all due respect, Sergeant Crawford hasn't been keeping up with the newer systems. We've been transitioning her to administrative duties because that's where her skills are best utilized at this stage of her career. Her skills? General Hayes stepped closer to Morrison, and despite being several inches shorter, her presence made him seem to shrink. Lieutenant, this soldier has 40 years of maintenance experience. She correctly diagnosed and repaired a problem that your entire team couldn't solve, and you think her skills are best utilized pushing paperwork. The modern military requires different skill sets, ma'am, Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. The modern military requires people who can actually fix things when they break, the general shot back. Staff Sergeant Cooper, how long have you been working on armored vehicles? 6 years, ma'am, Cooper answered, his earlier confidence completely gone. 6 years, and you genuinely believed a software patch fixed a hydraulic problem. I didn't actually inspect the hydraulic system, ma'am. The diagnostics said. The diagnostics don't say anything, Sergeant. They provide data. You're supposed to interpret that data using your knowledge and experience. The general turned back to Morrison. Lieutenant, I want to see Master Sergeant Crawford's performance evaluations for the past 3 years. Ma'am, those are personnel files. I'm a 3-star general conducting an inspection of this facility, Lieutenant. Get me those files, now. Morrison hurried off toward the administrative building. The assembled soldiers remained frozen in place, nobody daring to move or speak. Helen felt dozens of eyes on her, but she kept her gaze straight ahead, standing at attention. General Hayes walked slowly around the Abrams tank, running her hand along its surface. I started as a mechanic too, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet. 1989, fresh out of basic training. The male soldiers called me the girl for the first 2 years. Didn't matter that I could outwork most of them. Didn't matter that I saved their operations more times than I could count. She stopped walking and looked directly at Helen. It took me 15 years to make people see past my gender and recognize my competence. And you know what I learned in that time? The military is supposed to be better than the civilian world when it comes to merit. We're supposed to judge people by what they can do, not by how they look or how old they are or what gender they are. Morrison returned with a folder, slightly out of breath. The general took it and began reading, her expression growing darker with each page. This is interesting, she said. Struggles to adapt to new technology, better suited for desk work, should consider retirement soon. She looked up at Morrison. Lieutenant, did you write these evaluations? Yes, ma'am, based on my observations of Sergeant Crawford's performance. Your observations. The general closed the folder. Tell me, have you ever actually watched her work on a vehicle? Morrison hesitated. Not directly, ma'am, but I've reviewed the reports from her supervisors. You are her supervisor, Lieutenant. Yes, ma'am, I meant from the other technicians. Technicians she's supposed to be training. The general's voice was sharp now. Let me tell you what I observe, Lieutenant. I observe a master sergeant with 4 decades of experience who was sidelined by an officer who values computer printouts over actual competence. I observe a soldier who cared enough about her duty to fix a critical problem on her own time, without recognition, because she knew it was the right thing to do. And I observe a command structure that has failed her completely. Helen felt something shift inside her chest. In 40 years, nobody had spoken up for her like this. Nobody had challenged the dismissals, the casual disrespect, the slow erosion of her role. She had learned to accept it, to make herself smaller, to not make waves. But General Hayes wasn't accepting it, and hearing someone with real authority call out the injustice made Helen realize just how wrong it had all been. "Ma'am," Morrison began, but the general held up her hand. "I'm not finished, Lieutenant. Here's what's going to happen. Master Sergeant Crawford is going to conduct a complete inspection of every vehicle in this motor pool, not a paper review, a hands-on, under-the-hood, real inspection. And every technician on this base is going to watch and learn, because clearly they need the education." Cooper looked like he wanted to protest, but one glance at the general's face kept him silent. "Furthermore," General Hayes continued, "I want a complete review of how maintenance operations are conducted at Fort Jackson. I want to know who's actually doing the work, who's taking credit for it, and where the breakdowns in leadership are occurring. And Lieutenant Morrison, you're going to personally oversee this review with full transparency." "Yes, ma'am," Morrison said stiffly. The general turned to the assembled soldiers. "Let me be very clear about something. The United States Army runs on the backs of soldiers like Master Sergeant Crawford, people who show up every day, who do the hard work, who fix things when they break and keep us operational. If you're taking credit for work you didn't do, if you're dismissing experienced soldiers because you think technology has made them obsolete, then you're failing at your duty." She let those words sink in, then addressed Cooper directly. "Staff Sergeant, you have technical skills. I can see that from your record. But you lack wisdom and you lack integrity. You will write a full report detailing exactly what happened with yesterday's repair, including your failure to properly diagnose the problem and your error in taking credit for someone else's work. This will go in your permanent file." "Ma'am, I didn't mean to." "What you meant doesn't matter, Sergeant. What you did is what matters." Dismissed. Cooper saluted and walked away, his shoulders hunched. Several of the other young technicians looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with Helen. General Hayes turned back to Helen and her expression softened slightly. "Master Sergeant, I owe you an apology on behalf of the Army. You should never have been treated this way. Your experience is valuable. Your skills are needed. And your dedication to duty, even when you weren't being recognized for it, is exactly the kind of character we need in our NCO Corps." Helen felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had trained herself not to cry, not to show weakness, but standing here being acknowledged after so many years of dismissal was almost overwhelming. "Thank you, ma'am," she managed to say, her voice steady despite everything she was feeling. "Don't thank me yet," the general said with a slight smile, "because I'm about to make your life much more complicated." Over the next 3 hours, General Hayes conducted the most thorough inspection Fort Jackson had seen in years. Helen walked beside her, explaining maintenance procedures, pointing out issues that had been overlooked, demonstrating the difference between what the computers said and what the actual physical inspection revealed. They found 3 other vehicles with problems that hadn't been properly diagnosed. They discovered that maintenance schedules were being logged as completed when the work was actually superficial. They uncovered a pattern of young technicians relying too heavily on automated systems and not enough on fundamental mechanical knowledge. And through it all, the other soldiers watched Helen work. They saw her crawl under vehicles with an ease that belied her age. They watched her identify problems by sound, by smell, by the feel of a connection. They witnessed her explain complex mechanical systems in simple, clear terms that made sense. Specialist Martinez, the youngest technician, approached Helen during a break. He looked nervous but determined. "Sergeant Crawford," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I laughed when Cooper called you the old maintenance guy. I thought because you didn't use the computer systems like we do, you didn't know what you were doing. I was wrong." Helen looked at the young soldier, seeing genuine remorse in his face. "Apology accepted, Martinez, but let me give you some advice. Technology is a tool, not a replacement for knowledge. Learn the computers, yes, but learn the machines too. Get your hands dirty, make mistakes and learn from them. And most importantly, respect the people who came before you. We might be old, but we're not obsolete." "Yes, Sergeant," Martinez said. Would you? Would you be willing to train me, properly, I mean, hands-on?" Helen smiled. "I'd be honored." By late afternoon, General Hayes had completed her inspection. She called Lieutenant Morrison and the senior NCOs together for a private meeting in the base commander's office. Helen was included, though Morrison looked unhappy about it. "Colonel Briggs," the general addressed the base commander, "Fort Jackson has a serious problem. Your maintenance division is being run by people who value credentials over competence and technology over experience. If this base went to war tomorrow, half your vehicles would break down within a week because the people responsible for maintaining them don't actually understand how they work." Colonel Briggs, a career infantry officer who had always left the maintenance operations to his subordinates, looked stunned. "Ma'am, I had no idea the situation was this serious." "That's part of the problem, Colonel. You should know. These are your soldiers, your equipment, your responsibility." The general pulled out a notebook. "Here's what's going to change. Effective immediately, Master Sergeant Crawford is being appointed as the senior maintenance advisor for Fort Jackson. She will have direct oversight of all maintenance training programs and will report directly to you, Colonel, not through Lieutenant Morrison." Morrison's face went white. "Ma'am, that's highly irregular." "So is having a master sergeant with 40 years of experience filing paperwork while broken equipment sits in your motor pool, Lieutenant. Do you want to continue this discussion?" Morrison fell silent. "Master Sergeant Crawford," the general continued, "your new role will involve developing a comprehensive training program that combines modern diagnostic technology with traditional hands-on mechanical skills. You'll mentor the younger technicians and evaluate the readiness of all maintenance personnel. This is a significant increase in responsibility. Are you willing to accept it?" Helen felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. This was more authority than she'd had in years, more recognition than she'd ever expected to receive. But it also meant confrontation, meant standing up to people like Morrison and Cooper, meant fighting battles she had long since stopped fighting. She thought about her daughter's text from the night before. "You should be running that place, not filing reports." She thought about Martinez asking to be trained properly. She thought about all the young soldiers who would benefit from learning the right way to do things. "Yes, ma'am," Helen said firmly. "I accept." General Hayes smiled, a real smile this time, warm and approving. "Outstanding. Colonel Briggs, I want monthly reports on the progress of the maintenance division, and I'll be back in 6 months to conduct a follow-up inspection. If I don't see significant improvement, there will be command-level consequences. Am I understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Colonel Briggs said quickly. "Completely understood." The meeting concluded, and as people filed out, General Hayes pulled Helen aside. "Master Sergeant, a word in private." They stepped into an empty office. The general closed the door and her formal demeanor softened. "I meant what I said out there," she began. "But I also want you to know something else. What happened to you here isn't unique. It's happening across the military in ways both obvious and subtle. Women of our generation fought to prove we belonged, and we thought that battle was won. But now there's a new battle, proving that we still belong as we get older." Helen nodded, understanding completely. "The Army needs people like you," the general continued. "Not just for what you know, but for what you represent. You show the younger generation that experience matters, that dedication matters, that you don't become worthless the moment you turn 60. But more than that, you show other women that they can have long careers in this military, that they don't have to choose between service and aging. I appreciate that, ma'am, Helen said, but I have to admit I'm nervous. Morrison isn't going to make this easy. No, he won't, the general agreed. And that's why I'm giving you my direct contact information. If you face retaliation, if people try to undermine your authority, if you need support, you call me. Personally. That's an order. She handed Helen a card with her private number written on it. Helen looked at the card, then at the general. Why are you doing this for me, ma'am? You don't know me. General Hayes was quiet for a moment. 20 years ago, I was a captain being pushed out of my unit by a colonel who thought women couldn't handle combat support roles. A two-star general came through on an inspection, saw what was happening, and intervened. She gave me a chance when nobody else would. She told me that sometimes we have to be the support system we wish we'd had when we were younger. I'm just paying it forward, Master Sergeant. The two women shared a look of understanding that transcended rank and age, a recognition of shared struggles and shared strength. Now, the general said, her tone becoming businesslike again, let's go inform the rest of your motor pool about the changes. I want to see their faces when you tell them you're their new boss. The announcement was made in front of the entire maintenance division at 1600 hours. Colonel Briggs delivered the news with General Hayes standing beside him, her presence lending weight to every word. Effective immediately, Master Sergeant Helen Crawford is appointed as Senior Maintenance Advisor for Fort Jackson. She will have full authority over training programs, personnel evaluations, and maintenance protocols. All maintenance personnel, regardless of rank up to and including lieutenant, will answer to her on technical matters. The shock on the faces of the younger technicians was evident. Cooper looked like he had swallowed something bitter. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Helen stood at attention, her uniform crisp, her bearing professional. She had spent the past hour preparing mentally for this moment, knowing that how she handled it would set the tone for everything that followed. When Colonel Briggs finished speaking, Helen stepped forward. Thank you, Colonel, General Hayes. She turned to address the assembled soldiers. I know some of you are surprised by this appointment. Some of you might be upset. That's understandable. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't about me proving something. This is about making sure every soldier in this division can do their job correctly, safely, and effectively. She paused, making eye contact with the soldiers in front of her. For the past few years, I've watched mistakes happen that could have been prevented. I've seen equipment failures that should have been caught earlier. I've watched young soldiers being trained on computers instead of on machines. That ends now. Martinez raised his hand. Helen nodded at him. Sergeant Crawford, does this mean we're not going to use the diagnostic equipment anymore? No, Specialist. It means you're going to learn how to use the diagnostic equipment properly, and you're going to learn how to verify what it's telling you with your own eyes and hands. Technology is a tool, not a crutch. You should be able to diagnose a problem with or without a computer. Another soldier spoke up. What about those of us who prefer the new methods? You'll learn both methods, Helen said firmly. And then you'll use whichever method is most effective for the situation. But make no mistake, if you're under my supervision, you will learn the fundamentals. No exceptions. She saw a few nods among the crowd. Not everyone was resistant. Some of them seemed relieved, actually, to have clear direction and standards. General Hayes departed Fort Jackson at 1700 hours. Before she left, she shook Helen's hand one more time. 6 months, Master Sergeant. Show me what you can do. Yes, ma'am, I won't let you down. I know you won't. The first week in Helen's new role was challenging. Morrison maintained a cold professionalism, following the letter of her directives but not the spirit. Cooper was openly resentful, though he was careful not to violate any direct orders. Several of the younger technicians were skeptical, waiting to see if she would fail. But Helen had survived 40 years in the military. She knew how to handle resistance. She started by implementing a comprehensive assessment of every technician's actual capabilities. Not what their certifications said they could do, but what they could actually accomplish hands-on. Some of the results were eye-opening. Martinez, despite being one of the youngest, had strong fundamental skills and a genuine eagerness to learn. Cooper, for all his computer expertise, struggled with basic mechanical diagnostics. Several mid-level NCOs who had been coasting on seniority turned out to have significant knowledge gaps. Helen created individualized training programs for each person, pairing weak technicians with strong ones, requiring everyone to demonstrate proficiency in both traditional and modern methods. She led by example, working alongside the soldiers, teaching them not just what to do but why it mattered. Slowly, things began to change. One morning, about 3 weeks into her new role, Helen was conducting a training session on transmission systems when Morrison approached. "Sergeant Crawford, a word." They stepped away from the group. Morrison looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I let my own biases about age and technology cloud my judgment. You've accomplished more in 3 weeks than I managed in 2 years. The readiness reports are the best this division has seen, and I'm getting positive feedback from the colonel about the improved performance." Helen studied him carefully. The apology seemed genuine, though it clearly cost him something to deliver it. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant, but what I need from you now isn't an apology. It's support. These soldiers need to see that their chain of command is unified. If you're willing to work with me instead of against me, we can make this division truly excellent." Morrison nodded slowly. "Agreed. What do you need?" "I need you to stop second-guessing my methods in front of the troops. I need you to back my training requirements, even when they seem old-fashioned. And I need you to start learning some of this hands-on work yourself. You can't effectively supervise what you don't understand." He bristled slightly at that last part, but then his shoulders sagged. "You're right. I've been managing from behind a desk for too long. When's the next training session?" "Tomorrow morning, 0600. We're covering hydraulic systems." "I'll be there," Morrison said, and he was. Cooper took longer to come around. His resentment simmered for weeks until one day a vehicle malfunctioned during a field exercise. The computer diagnostics gave contradictory readings, and Cooper stood there, frustrated and uncertain, while other soldiers waited for direction. Helen approached quietly. "What does the diagnostic say?" "It says 3 different things," Cooper admitted. "Fuel system, electrical, and transmission. It can't all be broken." "No, it can't," Helen agreed. "So trust your other senses. What do you hear when the engine tries to turn over?" Cooper listened, really listened. "It sounds rough, like it's not getting enough fuel." "Good, what do you smell?" He sniffed. "Nothing unusual." "Exactly. If it was electrical or transmission, you'd smell burning, so it's probably fuel system. Now manually check the fuel line connections." Cooper got under the vehicle, and within 5 minutes found a loose connection that the computer hadn't detected, because the sensor was positioned after the break in the line. When he emerged, grease-stained but successful, Helen simply nodded. "Nice work, Sergeant." Something shifted in Cooper's eyes. Respect, maybe, or understanding. "Thanks for not making me feel stupid." "Why would I do that? Learning is how we get better, all of us." From that day forward, Cooper became one of Helen's strongest supporters, even volunteering to help teach some of the younger soldiers. The months passed quickly. Helen fell into a rhythm, arriving early each morning, working late into the evening, constantly teaching, evaluating, adjusting her methods based on what worked and what didn't. Her reputation spread beyond Fort Jackson. Other bases started asking about her training programs. The Army Times ran a feature article about the 62-year-old master sergeant who was revolutionizing maintenance training. Her daughter called one evening having seen the article. "Mom, I'm so proud of you, finally getting the recognition you deserve." "It's strange, honey," Helen admitted. "For so long I was invisible. Now suddenly everyone wants to know my methods, my story. I'm not sure I know how to handle being visible again." "Just keep being you, Mom. Keep doing the work, that's what matters." 6 months after General Hayes's initial visit, she returned to Fort Jackson for her promised follow-up inspection. This time, there was no demonstration scheduled, no advance warning. She simply arrived and asked to see the maintenance division at work. What she found exceeded her expectations. The motor pool was organized and efficient. Every vehicle was maintained to standard. The soldiers moved with confidence, using both diagnostic equipment and hands-on assessment. Morrison was actively involved in training, working alongside the troops rather than managing from an office. Cooper was teaching a class on integrated diagnostics to a group of junior soldiers. And in the center of it all, Helen moved from station to station, quietly correcting, teaching, encouraging. General Hayes observed for several hours before making her presence known. When she finally stepped forward, Helen came to attention. "Master Sergeant Crawford, status report." "Ma'am, all vehicles are mission ready. All personnel have completed basic and intermediate training certifications. We have 0 outstanding maintenance issues and a 98% on-time completion rate for scheduled services." Impressive in morale. Helen allowed herself a small smile. "Improved, ma'am. The soldiers know what's expected of them, they have the skills to meet those expectations, and they're proud of their work." The general nodded, then raised her voice to address the entire motor pool. "Soldiers of Fort Jackson Maintenance Division, 6 months ago this place was a mess. Poor leadership, inadequate training, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what it takes to keep military equipment operational. Today, you are a model for other installations. That transformation happened because one soldier refused to accept failure, even when she had every reason to give up." She turned to Helen. "Master Sergeant Crawford, on behalf of the United States Army, I thank you for your 4 decades of service, your dedication to excellence, and your unwavering commitment to doing things right. You are exactly the kind of NCO this military needs." The general reached into her jacket and pulled out a small box. "It is my honor to present you with the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services and achievements." Helen stood at attention as the medal was pinned to her uniform. Around her, the soldiers of the motor pool applauded, genuine appreciation in their faces. Even Morrison was clapping, and Cooper's eyes were suspiciously bright. After the ceremony, General Hayes pulled Helen aside one more time. "You know what the best part of this is? You're not done yet. You've got at least a few more years before mandatory retirement, and I'm going to make sure those years count. I'm recommending you for a position at the Army Maintenance Training Center. They need someone who can take what you've done here and spread it across the entire force." Helen felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. "Ma'am, that's a big job." "Yes, it is. Too big for just anyone, but not too big for you," the general smiled. "Think about it. You don't have to decide today. But Helen, you've earned the right to finish your career on your own terms, doing work that matters, with people who respect what you bring to the table. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." That evening, Helen sat in her apartment, the Legion of Merit on the table beside her. She thought about the young woman in the photograph on her wall, covered in grease and grinning beside a tank in the desert. She thought about all the years of being dismissed, overlooked, pushed aside. She thought about the past 6 months, the hardest and most rewarding of her career. Her phone rang. It was Martinez. Sergeant Crawford, sorry to bother you off duty, but I wanted to let you know I got accepted to Warrant Officer Candidate School. I'm going to become a maintenance warrant officer, and it's because of you. You showed me that this isn't just a job, it's a profession worth dedicating yourself to. After she hung up, Helen walked to her window and looked out at Fort Jackson. The lights of the motor pool were still on. Someone was always working, always training, always improving. She thought about General Hayes's offer, about the possibility of influencing maintenance training across the entire Army. It was daunting, certainly, but it was also an opportunity to ensure that other soldiers, especially other women, other older soldiers, wouldn't face what she had faced. Helen picked up the phone and dialed the general's number. "Ma'am, this is Master Sergeant Crawford. About that position at the training center. I accept." 3 months later, Helen stood in front of a classroom of maintenance instructors from bases across the country. On the screen behind her was the title of her presentation: Experience and Innovation, Integrating Traditional Skills with Modern Technology. She looked at the faces in the audience, some skeptical, some curious, all waiting to see what this 62-year-old master sergeant had to teach them. Helen smiled, pulled out a wrench from her toolkit and began. "Let me tell you about a tank that nobody could fix, and what it taught me about the real meaning of service." And in that moment, standing in front of people who were there specifically to learn from her experience, who respected her knowledge and valued her contribution, Helen Crawford finally felt like she had come full circle. She had started her career fighting to prove she belonged. She was ending it by helping others understand that belonging wasn't about age or gender or how you looked on paper. It was about competence. It was about dedication. It was about showing up every day and doing the work, even when nobody noticed. Especially when nobody noticed. Because eventually, someone would notice. Eventually, the truth would emerge. Eventually, the old maintenance guy would get the recognition she had earned. And she would use that recognition not for personal glory, but to lift up the next generation, to teach them, to show them that experience mattered, that people mattered, that the human element in technology could never be replaced by computers alone. As she taught that class, sharing 40 years of hard-won knowledge, Helen thought about all the soldiers who had dismissed her, all the times she had been called obsolete or out of touch. She felt no bitterness now, only a quiet satisfaction. She had proven them wrong not through anger or confrontation, but through simple, persistent excellence. She had fixed the tank. She had transformed the division. And now she would help transform the Army.